This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a line that used to exist and no longer does. For decades, there was a firewall between what a government did to its own people and what could trigger a war. That firewall is thinning, quietly, deliberately. What happens inside a country, in the streets, at night, under blackout, is now being treated as a switch that can turn on missiles. Without treaties, without votes, without debate, most people don't see it yet because it doesn't look dramatic. It sounds conditional, almost reasonable. But once a system ties internal violence to external force, it doesn't need intentions anymore. It only needs numbers. Stay with me. This matters. Because this shift doesn't belong to one country, and it doesn't end where it started. What controls the system now is not outrage, it's thresholds. And that's where this gets dangerous. I want to pull you away from the names, away from the faces, away from the shouting, because that's not what's in control anymore. What controls the system now is a rule that didn't exist before. Not a treaty, not a vote, not a declaration of war, a condition. If internal force crosses a certain line, external force is no longer optional. It becomes automatic. This is the quiet redesign. Power responding not to borders being crossed, but to body counts rising. Not to armies moving, but to crowds being fired on. Once that logic is installed, personalities stop mattering. Intentions stop mattering. Only metrics remain. How many, how fast, how visible. That's why statements now sound less like diplomacy and more like programming. If this happens, then that follows. And the danger isn't just the threat, it's the removal of friction. Because systems without friction don't pause, they accelerate. And somewhere inside that acceleration, a moment arrives where no one is choosing anymore. Which raises the next question: when did we agree to this shift? There was a time when this would have been unthinkable. Internal unrest was treated as internal. Repression was condemned. Sanctions followed. Statements were issued. And then the world moved on. That was the old rhythm. What changed wasn't a law. It was a habit. Over years, governments learned to speak about human rights the way markets talk about volatility. Not as absolutes, as tolerances. A few deaths became concerning. Dozens became unstable. Hundreds became a crisis. And somewhere in that slow calibration, the idea took hold that violence could be measured, managed, and priced. Before, intervention was tied to borders. Now it's tied to thresholds. That shift didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived through repetition, through watching, through waiting. Each delay taught the system something dangerous. That escalation doesn't have to be sudden to be decisive. Slow change is the most lethal kind because no one sounds the alarm while it's happening. And by the time it's visible, the system already believes this is normal, which is why the next moment didn't feel shocking at all. Numbers broke the calm. Not speeches, not statements, numbers. At least 65 people dead. That's the confirmed count. And among them, children. 7 under 18. At the same time, 40 members of the security forces killed. That ratio matters not because it tells us who is right, but because it tells us something else is happening. This is no longer crowd control. It's attrition. When a state starts losing enforcers at that scale, it changes the math inside the system. Fear stops flowing in one direction. Orders start to hesitate. And the response was immediate: lethal force. No leniency. Courts folded into command structures. Then the lights went out. A sweeping blackout. An attempt to seal the country from the outside world. To slow the numbers. To stop the images. But the information still leaked. Enough to be counted. Enough to be believed. If you're still watching, pause for a second and register this. Because this isn't the crisis. It's the symptom, and the system doesn't respond to symptoms. It responds to triggers, and one of them may already have been crossed. Here's the part most people miss. This system isn't held together by ideology or fear or even loyalty. It's held together by cash flow. The regime survives month to month, paycheck to paycheck, not as a metaphor, as a structural reality. Its power depends on paying the people who enforce it. The units in the streets, the courts that promise no leniency, the machinery that turns orders into action. That money comes from one place: energy, production, exports, and that's why labor matters more than slogans. When protests stay in the streets, the regime bleeds legitimacy. But when workers stop turning valves, it bleeds oxygen. This isn't theory, it's precedent. When oil workers stop working, the system doesn't wobble, it starves. Who benefits while the flow continues? The security apparatus, the command structure, the people issuing orders. Who absorbs the damage when it doesn't? Everyone else. Immediately, that's the hidden mechanism. The real leverage point, and once a system like this is exposed, it can't be unseen, which is why the next escalation didn't come from speeches. It came from speed. Everything sped up, decisions shortened, warnings tightened, language hardened. No more long explanations. No more diplomatic cushioning. Shoot, don't shoot. If you do, this follows, that's the entire instruction set now. On the ground, the response compressed into instinct. Crowds moving faster. Security units firing sooner. Judges pre-deciding outcomes. In the air, plans adjusted, not announced. Prepared, because systems like this don't wait for permission. They wait for confirmation. Every new casualty adds weight. Every image that escapes the blackout adds velocity. Every hour without resolution narrows the range of options. This is the dangerous phase, where restraint is no longer a policy, it's a race condition. Move too slowly, and you lose control. Move too fast, and you lose legitimacy. And the system doesn't care which one you lose first. What looks like chaos is actually compression. The future being pulled closer, minute by minute. And in that compression, the most fragile thing isn't the regime, it's the margin for error, because the next decision won't be reversible. Up to now, this can sound abstract. Systems, thresholds, acceleration. So let me narrow it. To you, if you're watching this, you live inside the downstream effects of these decisions, even if you're nowhere near the streets where this is happening. Because when internal violence becomes an external trigger, the price doesn't stay local. It shows up in markets, in energy costs, in alliances that harden overnight. It shows up when rules change without notice. When risk stops being theoretical, when escalation is no longer a headline, but a background condition, for the people living under blackout, it's simpler. Every day is a calculation. Go out or stay in, speak or disappear, work or starve. And the system watches all of it, quietly counting. If you want to understand where this is going, don't look at speeches. Look at how many people are still willing to take that risk. Stay with me. Because what happens next doesn't depend on ideology. It depends on exposure. And exposure never stays contained. This is the moment when it stops being local. Because once information escapes a blackout, it doesn't just inform, it recruits. Markets react before governments do. Allies recalibrate before statements are written. Adversaries start gaming outcomes they didn't plan for. Energy routes become questions. Shipping insurance becomes conditional. Diplomacy becomes contingency planning. What was framed as internal unrest now touches supply chains that cross continents. Prices move, currencies flinch, quiet assumptions about stability no longer hold. And that's when other governments start watching thresholds too. Not just the one in question, but their own. If violence here triggers force there, what happens elsewhere? Who sets the line? Who enforces it? And what happens when two systems disagree about where that line is? This is how local repression becomes a global variable. Not through speeches, through imitation. Once one firewall collapses, others weaken. And no one can be sure where the next breach appears, which is why the system feels tense now. Not explosive, unsettled. Because uncertainty doesn't spread like fire. It spreads like pressure. And pressure looks for release. From here, the system only has 3 directions it can move, not outcomes, paths. The first is adjustment. Violence slows. Thresholds aren't crossed again. The system exhales just enough to survive. Rules remain dangerous, but dormant. Nothing is fixed. It's simply deferred. The second is erosion. No single moment, no clear trigger, just a steady accumulation, more deaths, more warnings, more preparations that never quite turn into action until the line stops meaning anything at all and credibility dissolves quietly. The third is rupture. One incident too visible to ignore. One number too large to explain away. The condition flips. The response follows. Not because anyone wanted it, but because the system was built to do exactly that. None of these paths are clean. All of them carry cost. And right now, no one is publicly choosing. That's the danger. When systems move forward without declarations, the future arrives without permission. And we are closer now than we were a week ago. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to offer reassurance, to say there are adults in the room, that deterrence works. That lines, once drawn, will hold. But systems don't promise outcomes. They promise behavior, and this one has already changed its behavior. Internal violence is no longer contained. External force is no longer exceptional. And the space between the two is thinner than it has ever been. That doesn't mean war is inevitable. It means inevitability is no longer the standard. What happens next will not hinge on speeches or intentions. It will hinge on visibility, on numbers, on moments that feel small when they happen and irreversible when they're counted. So don't look away because it's uncomfortable. And don't assume this stays distant because it started somewhere else. If you want to understand how modern conflict actually begins now, not with invasions, but with thresholds, stay with this. Because the next time this system activates, it may not be framed as a warning at all. It may just happen. And by the time it does, the choice to pay attention will already be gone. If you want to see where this logic leads next, that's the conversation we're having in the next video.